Thank you so much. It's really wonderful to have everyone here, to have an opportunity to be learning Torah together. In particular, the fact, that we do Tanakh is so critical. Unfortunately, it's not certainly learned enough in the yeshivot, opportunity enough for the broader community to learn it. And particularly at this time of year where I find that the learning of Tanakh often connects us more directly to the sense of Dvar Hashem and the religious part of our personality in a way that learning Gemara and Halacha do not. So they are very important complements to one another. And I also feel significantly that the introduction over the last, I think it is 2 years, to be devoting the third track to aspects of Rosh HaShanah and Yom Kippur and to be scheduling this early before the Yamim Noraim is also of great importance, because I think all of us in the community need that extra sense of engagement and preparation, intellectually, emotionally, and spiritually. I was just told by Rabbi Yonah to slow down, so that is definitely a challenge for myself, but I will make every effort to do so. We are going to look today, and very soon I will do a screen share so we can follow along in the sources, although I hope you have the link available. We are going to look today at the theme of Malchios, kingship, on Rosh HaShanah, and how central that theme is to the nature of the day. I think some of us, I will just share for myself, growing up, the sense of focusing on God as king of the world. So there's a universal aspect, but I would say more personally, God's kingship over the Jewish people and what that sort of suggests about standing on the Yom Hadin before God was quite central to what Rosh Hashanah was about. And without to give away too much, I will say I was surprised to find that when we look more closely at the sources, the question about the role of Malchios, of kingship, is actually somewhat questionable in terms of a debate of the Tanaim, the rabbis of the Mishnah, what type of a role it plays. And even for ourselves, where Malchiot is one of the sort of 3 themes of the day, there's room to question what type of a role that it plays. And I want to just say, in contrast, though, there would be a reason to think it's the most central role, because the Malchiot, Zichronot, and Shofrot, which give expression to major themes of the day, God is king, it is a day of being remembered before God. And Shofarot itself is interesting because that is a sort of non-explicated symbol, and what exactly is the meaning of Shofarot is open to interpretation, but clearly it is a central aspect of what happens to the day. So those are the 3 major themes that we underscore during Musaf, where we blow the shofar. But throughout the rest of Rosh Hashanah, in the other tefillot, we still maintain the idea of kingship, even without those 3 middle sections, because the bracha, the third bracha in the Shmona Esrei is Hamelech HaKadosh. So right there at the beginning, God is the holy king. We don't normally use that word in the opening section. And then the middle bracha, which relates to the nature of the day, is Melech al kol haaretz, Mekadesh Yisrael v'yom hazikaron, king over the entire land, who sanctifies Israel and the day of remembrance. And that idea of framing it and putting it central in the blessing of the nature of the day seems to really highlight its centrality. So that's the issue we're going to look at. At the one hand, there's indications that it is really central, that it appears in all of the Shmona Esreis and right in the center. And one could say the fact that it opens Malchiot, Zichronot, and Shofrot indicates its centrality. And on the other hand, the sources you have yet to see actually throw this in question, and there will be a debate about how much this is actually one of the major brachot. So let's take a look now and turn to, I will share the screen, and now let me find where it is.
The link is in the chat if anyone would
Oh,
like.
so I could just open that link, I suppose. Let me open the link in the chat and then I'll share the screen.
It's also available for everyone else if they'd like to link that way.
Okay, thank you. And also, here we go. Okay. And I will actually also make it larger because, as you have heard and seen from what we do is available today, we are very highly prioritizing the issue of accessibility and making all of our public lectures available with closed captioning, and when on request with ASL. It wasn't always this way, and just to share a little sort of a personal vignette, I put out a parsha sheet, and this parsha sheet used to be like 10-point font, single-spaced, and so on. And people would say to me, yeah, Rabbi Linzer, it's so wonderful, but it's so hard to read. Can you make it a little bit bigger? And, I would sort of poo-poo it until, of course, I myself had a hard time reading it. So, and then I started making it 1.5 line space and a 12-point font. So sometimes it requires a real wake-up call. But we are, so I will, and with that in mind, I think this is pretty large the way it is. Maybe I'll make it a little bigger. How do you do this? Control plus or something? Okay, there we go. Okay, there we go. All right. So we'll start with sources 1 and 2, which are the verses in the Torah relating to blowing the shofar in Rosh HaShanah. Let's take a look. The Bnei Israel Lemor speak to the children of Israel, saying, "B'chodesh hashvi'i be'echad l'chodesh," on the seventh month because it's counting from Nisan, the month of the Exodus, on the first of the month. Yelachem Shabbaton, it should be a day of rest. Zichron Tru'ah Mikra Kodesh.
Rabbi Linzer, I'm going to stop you for a second. A number of people are pointing out that it's still very small.
Oh, it
Perhaps
is?
you can either do a full screen view or there's very large margins on the left and right. Perhaps you can zoom in more.
Okay, how do you do that?
Go to view and the Google Doc options for, there you go. That could do it.
In here, this?
That works. Zoom.
Oh, I see.
Try that.
Is that better? I can make it even bigger. Is that better?
There you go. Yeah.
Yes? Okay, terrific. Thank you for stopping me.
Okay.
Okay, so it is a day of rest and a day of remembrance of blasts. It surprisingly doesn't even mention the shofar. So there at least is an aspect of remembrance and blast, but interestingly does not explain more than that why we do it, and doesn't even mention the shofar. The next verse is similarly unclear. This is in Bamidbar. Uvachodesh hashvi'i be'echad lachodesh, on the first of the month, in the 7th month. Mikra kodesh yelachem, kol melechas avodah lo tasu, a holy convocation, don't do work. So that's true of every Yom Tov. Yom Tru'ah yelachem, it shall be a day of shofar blasts. Again, not explaining the shofar, not explaining the significance. So it is a very, it is I think the only mitzvah in the various Yamim Tovim that the Torah is not explicit on what we're supposed to do. It doesn't say use a shofar. It doesn't even say blow a shofar. And in particular also does not explain the significance of the ritual. And it also doesn't explain the significance of the day. So that's really the starting point. And one thing that I would suggest at the outset, I think we now frame it as the day of judgment, and we think about it in connection with Yom Kippur, but there's, I think, a range of possible meanings, and it is possible that the rabbis, when they instituted Malchiot, Zichronot, and Shofarot, and we'll see where they get the idea of kingship, because again, to refer you to source 1, the idea of Zikaron is mentioned and of shofar blasts, but the idea of kingship is absent. So but we will see where they get that idea. And then those 3 themes will be saying, okay, these are the 3 themes of the day. It's not clear in the Torah, but we're going to identify these 3 themes. But it doesn't actually end there, because for people that know how the Malchiot, Zichronot, and Shofarot are structured, the central part is 10 verses. It opens with a framing meaning, what, like God, you remember the actions of the world. then it lists 10 verses, 3 from the Torah, 3 from the later writings, and 3 from the prophets. And then it ends with a blessing, that again repeats an aspect of the theme. Shomea kol turat amo Yisrael barachamim, for example, you hear the shofar blasts with compassion. That would be for shofarot. And what I think really significant about the use of all of those verses is that it creates a multivocal way of expressing what is the theme of the day, even within those 3 themes. What's the significance of kingship? I don't know. You could say a lot of things about why kingship is an important idea. Well, here are 10 psukim. Take your pick. Different ways of expressing the meaning and the significance of kingship. What does it mean that God remembers us? Is God remembering us to hold us to, a standard of justice? Is God remembering us like God remembers Sarah to do good? What does zichronos mean? Well, here are 10 psukim, different ways of thinking about it. And the same in particular with shofarot, which are just so unclear what the meaning of shofarot is, what the significance is. So I don't know if people still remember, I was growing up, I had the Bern Ba Machzor. I'm guessing that there are people, I see some nods, are people out here that remember a time when it wasn't art school and now it's, Koren. The Bern Ba Machzor. And the Bern Ba Machzor, when you get to the shofarot section, it says 10 reasons why we blow the shofar. No, it wasn't shofar. I think it was before Tkiyat shofar. 10 reasons why we blow shofar in Rosh HaShanah. Initially that felt to me like, oh my God, am I supposed to be thinking of all of them and which ones and so on? But then I realized, and I don't know if this was intentional, that it parallels what we do in the Shemona Esrei. Even within these themes, each one of them is open for possible different interpretation. So I think that there is something quite beautiful about this, quite beautiful about not sort of forcing us in a box, taking an open-ended, pasuk about what the nature of the day is, identifying core themes, but still letting us have our own voices in ways of identifying which aspects of those themes sort of resonate with us and we are going to most identify with. And it's actually interesting that in the Gemara, it was actually, you had an option which verses to use. Not everybody was scholarly enough to choose, but go ahead, pick yourself which verses you want to use, which themes you want to express. So I think that's important as we discuss the centrality of Malchiot and what Malchiot is about, to notice the sort of way in which even that theme and even all of the themes are themselves potentially multivocal, and that we give expression to that in the Shemona Esrei. Since we're talking about Malchiot, Zichronot, and Shofrot, I can't resist, and the idea of the psukim, one insight that I haven't heard from others, and I think is a very simple point, but helps appreciate the structure, because the structure goes from verses in the Torah to verses in the later writings, and then verses in the prophets. And, I assume we all know that the natural order of the canon is Tanakh, Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim. So why is it that we reverse the order and quote the verses from the Ketuvim before those from the Nevi'im? And to me, it just struck me, I don't know when, that the answer is obvious, that Nevi'im are a vision of the future. And Nevi'im talk about the future. And in a way, quoting verses from the Torah could refer to the past or the present, but obviously they sort of, were there in the past. Ketuvim happened at a later stage, so more maybe of a sense of presence. And then after we've sort of laid out sort of the present way we can identify the meaning or how it speaks to us in the present, we can also identify how it speaks to us in the future. So to use shofar as an example, there's the shofar of standing at Har Sinai, and there's the shofar of the Mashiach and of the future redemption. So I think that helps us appreciate the arc of those verses and why we end with Nevi'im. Okay, all of that was sort of somewhat as a parenthetical or framing, but I think critical for us to appreciate the themes of the day. And that's really what we're talking about, and particularly the theme of Malchiot. So now let's turn, I guess I'll pause which goes with speaking slowly. Take a little drink here of my soda. So there you go. And I think what I would do is encourage people to, I might pause to ask particular questions from all of you, and then I'll encourage you to write, your thoughts in the chat. And Rav Yonah can sort of summarize or collate them and and share them. But just in general, if you have questions going along, please put them in the chat. And Rav Yonah, I would ask you to find the appropriate time, maybe, to present them and raise them. So let's take a look at the Mishnah on Rosh HaShanah. That's in the Torah. Now we turn to the Tannaitic period, where we will see that the structure of the Shemona Esrei on Rosh HaShanah is somewhat in flux. And this is not only true about Rosh HaShanah, it's true about the Shemona Esrei in general. There was a period where it was being concretized and finalized, and also something that I'll get back to. There's evidence that it was not, it was a long time before became one text. Even after the Gemara and the period of the Geonim, it seems that there were different traditions present. And just to give you an example that relates to the Yamim Noraim, what's the last bracha we make in Shemona Esrei? So the classic bracha is, you bless your people with peace. During the Aseret Yemei Tshuva from Rosh HaShanah through Yom Kippurim, many people have the bracha Oseh HaShalom, who does peace. So I don't say that. And it actually deeply bothered me why people say it, because the Gemara does not say anywhere that you make a different final bracha. So if the Gemara is not giving license or requiring a different final bracha, how is it that we do so? And then I found out that actually in texts from the Cairo Geniza, from the Geonic period, the bracha of Oseh HaShalom was their standard bracha every single day of the year. That is how they ended the Shemona Esrei every day of the year. So embracing it on Rosh HaShanah and the Aseret Yemei Tshuva is a way of saying this is also a legitimate bracha, and somehow it speaks more central to this period of time. So that's just a sort of fascinating something that came to my awareness, and important for us to just generally realize about the sense of the flux and the of how the text of the Shemona Esrei came about, and that sometimes there were varying traditions even after the time of the Gemara. So we should be aware of that, and that is something that I will come back to about the Malchiyot. So let's take a look at this debate. Seder Brachot in source number 3. Here's the order of the blessings of Shemona Esrei. Omer Avot Ugvurot Ukdushat Hashem. So those are the classic 3, the aspect about the forefathers, Magen Avraham, the aspect of God's power and might, right? Mechayei HaMeitim, and God is as holy, right? Ha'el HaKadosh. The Kolel Malchiot Imahem Ve'eno Tokeh. So this first opinion, which we'll see is the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, says that you fold in kingship into this blessing without doing tkiyot. So what do you think he means? This is an actual question, not rhetorical. What do you think he means that you fold in kingship into this first blessing? What would the blessing be?
Feel free to pop your answers into the chat while we're
and just for my focus, I'm not going to look at the chat. So review okay. So what do you think it means that you take this idea of God's sanctity and you include the theme of Malchiyot? Aviona, what are you seeing in the chat? Nothing?
I'm seeing people thinking still.
While
they're doing that, maybe you could answer. Someone asked a clarifying question. What does it mean that when was the Amid actually finalized? When was it actually canonized?
I don't know. Like I said, I mean, clearly in the Gemara, there tends to be, a narrowing of options and a growing of consensus. But as I said, the Gemara rarely says this is the exact text or this is the way you have to do the final bracha. and parallel traditions, as I mentioned, were in the Gonic period. And I don't know if we can identify a particular date. I really don't. I mean, I'm sure there's somebody who, who has a sense of when those alternatives fell off, but I don't know. Okay.
To answer your question, a couple of people have now put in the chat the idea that we say Hamelach HaKadosh instead of Hakel HaKadosh.
Right. So I think that is correct. And therefore, for this first opinion, the theme of Malchios is folded into that first bracha. Okay. And then we have Kedushat Hayom V'Tokea. You say the sanctity of the day. So, Baruch Atah Hashem, Mekadesh Amo Yisrael V'Yom HaZikaron. This is the holy day, and you identify the name of the day. Zichronot V'Tokea. The blessing of God remembers us, the 10 verses, and then there's a Tekiyat Shofar, Shofarot V'Tokea, and then Shofarot. Divrei Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. So for Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, I think it's fair to say that he does not give that much weight to kingship. There's no Tekiyot. So without getting into a whole discussion of the relationship of the Tekiyot to these to the Malchiot, Zichronot, and Shofrot, how they're integrated, clearly not doing Tekiyot means that you don't give it the same weight and you don't bring it into the central experience, of the day, which is communicated through its integration with the Shofarot. It just gets folded into one of our existing blessings. Yes, now there's more of a theme today about kingship, so we'll mention that, but it doesn't get its own blessing and it doesn't get the blowing of the shofar. Rabbi Akiva takes strong issue with this. Amar lo Rabbi Akiva, im eino tokeh l'malchiot, lama hu maskir? What purpose is malchiot without the blowing of the shofar? And presumably what he means is, if you're not prepared to recognize this as a theme of the day, as is indicated by the fact that you don't have shofar with it, so you're basically saying, I don't see this as a theme of the day, then why do you even put it in the opening bracha? If the day isn't about kingship, it's not about kingship. Now, there could be an answer to that, of course. Well, there's an element of kingship, it's not central, but what you see here is exactly this, the core of their debate. That Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri does feel it's quite secondary, it's not a central theme. And Rabbi Akiva says, if you're going to acknowledge Malchiot, then it is an equal central theme and it has to get shofar. Ela Omer Avot U'Gvurot U'Kedushat Hashem, you say the three classic opening brachot, V'Cholel Malchiot in Kedushat Hayom V'Tokea. And then where do you incorporate Malchiot? In the blessing of the sanctity of the day. So that is, you say, Melech al kol haaretz, Mekadesh Yisrael v'yom hazikaron. You are bringing it into that middle, to that bracha of the sanctity of the day, which maybe makes it the most central, because the Malchus is mentioned with the very sanctity of the day, and there are Tekiyot, so it certainly is as central as everything else. Zichronot v'Tokea and v'Shofarot v'Tokea. Now, so you do the other sections and you blow. Now, some of you might be wondering, why not have 4 blessings? One about the sanctity of the day, and then Malchiot, Zichronot, Shofarot. So the Gemara discusses that there's an assumption only 9 blessings, and you have to make 10 themes fit into 9 blessings. So where do you include Malchiot? So Rabbi Akiva has it in the center blessings and folded into the sanctity of the day. So I think it's fair to say that the core debate here is how central it is. Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, very secondary, and Rabbi Akiva says, no, you got to put it in the central blessings, you have to blow the shofar, and the fact that he connects it with the sanctity of the day indicates that maybe it is the most central aspect. Now, before we continue, I want to use this as a moment to reflect on the idea of competing versions of the Shemona Esrei. Because if you actually try to take yourself away from our current text, you could come to the conclusion not only that Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri does not have, Malchiot in the center, which is not our practice, but maybe Rabbi Akiva doesn't have it in the opening section. Maybe Rabbi Akiva would have said Ha'el HaKadosh. Why do I have to say HaMelech HaKadosh? I'll get to the Malchiot in a second. And the Malchiot is in the middle with the sanctity of the day. So it's possible that there's a position of Hamelech HaKadosh without Malchiot in the central theme. And there's a position of Malchiot in the central theme and no need to mention it at the beginning. And what we have done to some degree is embrace both. We have Hamelech HaKadosh, and we have, of course, really the weight of Rabbi Akiva of Malchiot in the center. So what have we seen so far? I want to say one other thing, but pause for a little summary. We've seen that the Torah is not clear what the central theme of the day is, or even that there's a mitzvah of blowing shofar. The rabbis learn out, one pasuk mentions the idea of remembrance and blowing the shofar. So that can clearly bring those two themes into the conversation. Kingship is not mentioned in those verses, which clearly seems to be the source of the debate of how central or important kingship is to the day. We mentioned that the idea of all of the verses help recognize the multivocal nature even within those themes themselves, but certainly the big question is kingship. And we then saw the debate of Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri and Rabbi Akiva, where Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri sort of makes it secondary. He just incorporates it into a standard blessing. He does not blow the shofar. And Rabbi Akiva makes it central with the other zichronot and shofarot. It gets its equal presence in the Shemona Esrei. It gets the blowing of the shofar, and maybe it's even more central because of its integration with the blessing of the sanctity of the day. One more thought about, and the last point we made was we might embrace both positions. We certainly embrace Rabbi Akiva that we say the shofarot in the center with the blowing of the shofar. Excuse me, the malchiot with the blowing of the shofar. But it's possible Rabbi Akiva said Ha'el HaKadosh. And in that way, we also embrace Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri and we say HaMelech HaKadosh. And I want to take that one step further because, it is not clear, and the Gemara never speaks about saying, Yechein tein pachtecha. Where does that come from in the Shemona Esrei? Before, in the third blessing, before you get to HaMelech HaKadosh, there's this whole section of God, you should give your fear and the awe of you on the entire land. Everybody should recognize that you are the God. Evil should be destroyed from the land. Baruch atah Hashem HaMelech HaKadosh. So where did that whole section of Yechein tein pachtecha come from? And I sort of speculated, and then somebody told me Rav Soloveitchik said the same thing. I don't know if there's any evidence, historical evidence to this, that is a vestige of Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. For Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, who would say HaMelech HaKadosh as part of Ha'el HaKadosh, the third blessing, you don't just jump to the bracha, you elaborate on the theme. You want to say something about Malchus, even if it's secondary. You want to elaborate on what that theme is about. So that actually Yechein tein pachtecha is Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri's bracha of Malchiot. So I think that's just really worth appreciating, that our practice might actually embrace both positions. That if we're going to speak about God, Ha'el HaKadosh, recognize, God's identity, as it were, to be Yachol, then on this day we want to emphasize, God is Melech, and we're going to embrace Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, and we're actually going to have the remnant of his bracha of Malchiot, all of that section of Yechein tein pachtecha. That's his approach. He would not have it in the middle section, and for that we embrace Rabbi Akiva and also recognize it as a central theme equal or greater than Zichronot v'Shofarot. So right now, if you take nothing else from this lecture, you can walk away with, I think, an appreciation that there's a debate about how central Malchiot is, and part of that is the fact of its absence from the verse. And that debate translates into whether it was in the central section of the Shemona Esrei with the blowing of the shofar or not. And that it's quite possible that not only do we embrace Rabbi Akiva, which is the most obvious, that we embrace him because we have the Malchiot section in the center with the blowing of the shofar, but to some degree we embrace Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri about the importance of maybe not making it a central theme of the day, but making it about how we relate to God during this day and bringing it in to the Ha'el HaKadosh bracha, saying HaMelech HaKadosh and having the V'chein Tein Pachtucha, which could be his basic structure of the Malchiyot in that third bracha. So I'm going to pause because that's, I think, a good way to summarize where we're up to right now. And I'll take a drink of my soda and let everybody say any comments you'd like to in the chat, and Rabbi Berman to share with me some of the comments or questions.
Great. And just from a time perspective, we have about 25 minutes left. So we're just past the halfway point for those of you keeping score at home or actually in the YCT office. I see Rabbi Linzer, you're actually in our at the yeshiva today.
That is correct.
With your beautifully new painted blue wall.
Live from YCT.
We return in person to the Beit Midrash this year. Someone asked if you could elaborate, please, on the idea of the shofar blasts, specifically relating to Malchiyot. So
I think that's a general question of the relationship of the shofar to Malchiyot and Zichronot. Zichronot, maybe we could connect it to, if we wanted to, to the ram which is in place of Yitzchak on the Akedah. If we wanted to connect this to Malchiyot, we could certainly speak about the idea that when a king, it's like the blowing of the trumpets when you announce the king. But it's also possible that it doesn't directly integrate with the theme, that it's a way of sort of one classic understanding of how they come together is that the shofar becomes our vehicle of calling out to God. It's a more powerful aspect of prayer through this shofar. And therefore, the whole engaging with the themes of the day is sort of the central aspect that we want to be focusing on and, reaching out to God in that context. So it's more a generic type of a loudspeaker of our prayers than a specifically sort of symbolic connection. But I don't think it's too hard to identify the symbolic connection as well. The standing at Har Sinai with the shofar, the sense of God's presence, the sense of the future. The shofar will be blown in the Messianic times. So a good number of the verses that we cite actually integrate the two, and I would encourage people to go through those verses and to see more of that. Okay. Any other question or comment to be made at this time?
At the moment, that's it. Feel free to keep going, and I'll let you know in a few minutes.
Wonderful. So I will assume that means that everybody's understanding everything, which is fabulous. Maybe it has
I have one more if you'd like.
I was going to say maybe it has something to do with the fact that I'm going at half my usual speed, which is maybe a lesson right there. Yes, Rabbi Berman.
What, do you want to take another question, or do you want to keep moving forward?
Let's take one more brief question. I think it will allow for a brief pause, and then we'll continue on.
Great. So this is a follow-up to the previous question about shofar with Zichronot, with Malchiyot. Sorry, the question was also, what's the zikaron of us and Am Yisrael and Klal Yisrael? That's the way the question.
Okay, so that one I will say, come back next year and we will do Zichronot, and maybe the 2 years from now we'll do Shofarot. But that I think is a little something to be discussed at a later time.
Okay.
So I'm going to read this next source, just excerpt something because of sensitivity to the time, where it's the Sifra, which is the Tanaitic sort of commentary on the Vayikra. And what I'll just see is the final position of Reb Yossi, Reb Yehuda, which starts pointing us to maybe a way of understanding more specifically what Malchiyot is about. So let's look at this. This is the final paragraph. Reb Yossi Reb Yehuda Omer, Mal Talmud Lomer v'hayu lachem lezikaron lifnei Hashem Elokechem. So this is a verse by the trumpets, not by the shofar. So it mentions that is a remembrance. So zichron is at least a word we have, a theme we have by Rosh HaShanah. And it says it's a remembrance before God. So the remembrance connects to God. So why does it repeat after it says being remembered by God? I am God. Okay, so that's not just saying you're remembered by God, but God is sort of emphasizing his sort of status, his role, and therefore the zebinyan of kol makom shata omer zichronot atzomech la malchiyot. So this teaches you. So they see in those words, "I am God," which is somewhat superfluous, that's God's sort of ruling kingship. And this teaches you the importance of putting this together with zichronot. So it does seem, by the way, it doesn't explain why we juxtapose, what the meaning of it is. But I would say the idea of the juxtaposing does not sound so much to be giving so much weight to the Malchiot. So it's another way of thinking, of acknowledging what the source is, but this will become clearer as we look at other sources, a greater clarity on what sort of way it relates to the other blessings. I do want to pause for a moment and say something that scholars have pointed out, which is the absence or the almost complete absence of the Malchiot theme, not just in verses about Rosh HaShanah, but in pretty much all of the Torah. You know, going like from the Breshit through Dvarim, you would be hard pressed to find any discussion of king. I mean, you have like a mention in sort of Breshit about these are the kings of Melech Edom. You sort of have it by, you know, the whole issue about Midian, Malchei Midian, and you have it in the Torah about if you choose to make for yourself a king. But for the most part, the Torah, the kings are something in the surrounding society. The king is maybe something in the future for us to do when we're in the land. It seems that it's not a central metaphor for us. And I might want to say that I think that that is true right now as we daven Shmona Esrei, to use the metaphor of king when we don't have a direct experience of king is it doesn't resonate as emotionally. I am sure that the Jews in Tsarist Russia, you know, who are able to think of the Tsar could really feel that awe and power of the king. And for us, it doesn't resonate so much. And some want to say that that's why it's so hard to find it. You know, it's much easier to find it in the prophets and in the later writings because there they had lived under, you know, the kings of Israel, and it was a very dominant part of their mentality. But that might be why it really is not in the Torah so much. Even here, the verse was quoted, "I am the Lord your God," didn't say, "I am the Lord your God, your king." So that might help us understand how challenging it is to identify this and to underscore its centrality to the theme of the day. Okay, so let's now look also very briefly at this next source, which gives like other ways of introducing the Malchus sort of theme. I wonder if anybody is counting how many times I said the word theme during this lecture. Anyway, okay. Okay, so now let's look at Rabbi Nosson. Rabbi Nosson actually helps clarify the role of Malchios, assuming it is in the middle brachot. So let's look, this is the middle paragraph. Rabbi Nosson Omer, Einot Tzarich, you don't need that verse that was quoted in the first paragraph to this idea about Malchiot. Sharei kvar ne'emar utkatem b'chatzos rot. So that's, you know, verse that was quoted easier by the trumpets. You shall blow the trumpets. Hooray, shofar. That's that, although it's trumpets, it's an idea that's analogous to the shofar. It should be a remembrance. Zikaron. Okay, so we are using now the trumpets. They have the idea of blasts. They have the idea of zikaron. And and like was said before, I am the Lord your God. That is associated with the idea of kingship. So now he says 1 minute. So in the verses, kingship comes at the end. And if something comes at the end, you could see it as less important, but you could also see it as the goal, the arc, right? You blow the shofar, you ask God to remember us, or we remember God, and ultimately it recognizes God as king. So if that's the way it's in the verse, why did the rabbi switch the order and put the kingship first? And then remember it in shofar. Ella, here was the message they were trying to communicate. First, accept God as your God, make him your God. And then pray to God for compassion. You'll be remembered by him, meaning like sort of like Sarah was remembered, you'll be remembered with compassion. A shofar of freedom. Now that's an interesting phrase, which basically, if you look at the next section, means sort of like the shofar of ultimate redemption. So recognize God as king in order that it's not that everything is building up to God as king. Remember God as king in order that we can approach God with prayers of remembrance and ultimately anticipate the messianic period. So I think that this position is quite significant. It accepts that Malchiot is right there in the middle with shofarot and zichronot, but it says it would be wrong to think that it is, if you would, a goal of the day. It is a prerequisite. It is a necessary framing that allows us to get to what the day is about. It's a framing that says, if we can, that in order for God to remember us, or maybe for us to stand b'yom hadin, us to do tshuva, or us to pray that this is a day where God sort of determines the decree, and to be able to make that request and approach God, we have to recognize that God is king, that God is all powerful and will be making that decision about our fate and the fate of the world. But the focus is the prayers for the year, for standing in justice, and ultimately for the future redemption. So here Malchios becomes a framing, but not central. Or if you would, framing makes it sound central. So let me say, becomes sort of like a introduction or a necessary prerequisite or awareness to allow us to get to the central theme. So what we have now is presumably three different approaches. We have Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri that I think really sidelines it. It's not in the verse. So, okay, we mention it, it's there. And maybe, we mentioned that that's how we see God today. But ultimately, it's not a central theme. We have Rabbi Akiva that really underscores its centrality, maybe even bringing it into the blessing of, not maybe, bringing it into the blessing of the day itself, and certainly giving it equal weight. And then we have Reb Nosson, who I think is somewhere in the middle. It is an important theme, but it's a framing theme. It's an introductory theme. It's not the most central. Three different ways of thinking about it, all emerging, or at least the ones that don't make it as fully central, emerging from its lack of explicit statement, in the Torah itself. I want to say something. I want to break for a moment to talk a little bit about, just to share personally for myself. I did say that growing up, Malchiot was very central in how I understood the day. But, a lot of that was sort of Malchiot as a sense of din. God is king and it recognizes we're standing the din. And to some degree, Reb Nosson is saying, fine, then it's really ultimately not Malchiot per se, but Malchiot because of din and because of being remembered, which is getting us to the middle blessing. And, this is something that I've written about in Divrei Torah about Rosh HaShanah, that I read a Sfat Emet that speaks about embracing Malchiot in a fuller way. And how would we think of Malchiot if we removed the theme of din? So that's really radical. Maybe it's the Rabbi Akiva position that makes it part of the blessing of the day, to see it not just as equal, but as primary. What would it mean to think of Rosh HaShanah as a day of Malchiot without any aspect of din? So one way to think about it is we are just joyous that God is our king, that we recognize God as our king and God is in our lives and we are, God's chosen people. And that is just something to celebrate in itself. Take the fear and the judgment out of it and embrace that aspect of Malchios. And, some people might know that for Sephardim, I don't want to overly generalize, but for many Sephardim, the idea of Rosh Hashanah as a joyous day is actually much more present than for Ashkenazim, where it's all of this sort of about wigginess and fear and so on. I know that there are one of our people here at the Hebrew Institute, Rabbi Dov Linzer, told me, or maybe somebody else I'm forgetting, oh yeah, Rosh Hashanah, we have a barbecue in the backyard. It's like, it's Yom Tov, you can cook. So it's like, wait, what? That's Rosh Hashanah? You're supposed to be miserable the whole day. So anyway, I think it also depends where you're davening, again, not to sort of, here at the Hebrew Institute, the tunes are extremely joyous. In other places, they're more sort of awe-filled. So it is interesting thinking about the Rabbi Akiva position and focusing on that per se, without even introducing the sense of din. And the Sfas Emes takes it in a different direction, which I also found very powerful. And this connects maybe to the blowing of the Chauffeur of Freedom that was mentioned before, the Messianic period. All of the blessings of Malchiot, right, tend to speak about what a world would look like if God was recognized as king. The Aleinu introduces Malchiot, everybody will recognize you. L'taken olam b'malchut Shaddai. It's about, we recognize you, God, as king now, but in the future, when the whole world does, what would that world look like? And maybe one thing to think about on Rosh HaShanah is to spend some time asking ourselves, not just what do we want ourselves to look like or our family to look like, which tends to be the type of reflection as we do tshuva. What do we want to be better? How do we want to sort of think about our whole family and our relationship to our spouse and our children and our parents and do differently and so on? But to actually spend some time imagining and envisioning what do we imagine as a better world, right? If we think about God's kingship and what does God's kingship mean to be realized, what do we think about a better world? A world that's more just, a world that's more, recognizes the value of every individual, a world that is more sort of, religious in a healthy way rather than secular, or maybe say spiritual. And I think that can be a very powerful and inspiring thing to be bringing into Rosh Hashanah and to getting us out of the hyper focus on ourselves, which can lead to a sense of guilt and shame and not be productive. And thinking about what do we want to do in this coming year to bring the world a little closer to one of Malchios, of where, a more perfect world where God's kingship is more expressed. So,
Rabbi Linzer, 10-minute warning.
10-minute warning, thank you. So what we've seen so far is that there's a question about the presence of Malchiot at all as a theme of the day, and that we have seen three different opinions. One of Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri that brings it into that sidelines it and makes it part of Hamelach HaKadosh. Rabbi Akiva that makes it very central with the Tkiot and integrates it into the sanctity of the day. And finally, the last position, and I'm forgetting who said it, Rabbi Natan, who says that it is a framing and a way to get to Zichronot. It's there, it's important, but it's more of a framing. So now with the 10-minute limit, I want to look at two other sources that speak about Malchiot as a type of a framing. So here's one in source number 7 by Kriyat Shema. And here's what it says. Amar Rabbi Yoshua ben Karcha, says Rabbi Yoshua ben Karcha, Lama kidma shma l'haya im shamoa. What is the order? Why do we start with the paragraph of Shema and then the paragraph of it will be when you listen? Why not reverse the order? Now, of course, that's the order that appears in the Torah, but what is a conceptual way of understanding the arc from Shema Yisrael to V'haya im shamoa? Ella, Kidei she'yikabel of O malchut shamayim tchila. The same phrase we saw before. You start by accepting God's kingship. And then you accept the yoke of the mitzvot. So there is obviously here, the idea of accepting God's kingship is not just a way to getting to the mitzvot, right? It's necessary. You can't speak about the mitzvot without recognizing your relationship to God. But obviously, there's a reason why Shema Yisrael, the Jews died with that on their lips, is like a central articulation of our faith, right? We believe in a universal God and in our God, Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, and that is the sort of central core of our faith. And once we begin with that and our relationship to God, Ve'ahavta Hashem Elokecha, then we can talk about doing the mitzvot. The mitzvot might be an expression and a reinforcing. They allow God, if we recognize God, to command us, but ultimately, it both frames and leads to the mitzvot, and it is the most core articulation of our faith. So this, in a way, hits both notes. Malchiot as central and Malchiot as introductory. And I might also say, I can't resist myself, and I know I'm giving a lot of ideas, but I can't resist that there might be a nice parallel of Shema, V'Hayayim Shamoa, and the Tzitzit to Malchiot, Zichronot, and Shofarot, right? Because if Malchiot is God's kingship, right? And maybe it's a little reversed because the tzitzit you're supposed to remember, but the mitzvot are the way of expressing it, and the zichronot are sort of the way of keeping it always in mind, the tzitzit rather. One can see somewhat of a parallel. I won't push it because it's a little forced. But anyway, here we do see that it both is an important framing and something really central in itself, okay? And I think maybe, let me just check here, maybe this will be a good place actually to stop and take some final questions. So there's a little more to say about this and about how these debates play out in the discussions about fast days and so on. But the rest really is not central to what, to the theme. And so I think we can leave it off. So what I'll just say to pull it together, to remind us what we said, and then to open it for 5 minutes of questions. We saw that the Torah does not have a hint to the theme of Malchios in verses about the shofar, and even other verses that are quoted. They speak about, I am the Lord your God. They don't mention kingship. So that really makes it hard to sort of bring kingship into the equation. We noted sort of as a footnote that kingship was not a central theme in the Torah altogether, and therefore maybe not a sort of a resonant metaphor or an image to be using, in the Torah, but became more dominant later in the period of Chazal, and the struggles we have, I think, with relating to that metaphor. So Malchiot is mostly, absent in the Torah, certainly by Rosh HaShanah and also in general, which leads to a debate about, do we really make it part of our Shemona Esrei, how central of a theme during Musaf of Shemona Esrei, where Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri very much sidelines it, puts it in Hamelech HaKadosh. Rabbi Akiva puts it centrally, and maybe even the most central, connecting it to Yom HaZikaron. We also pointed out, interestingly, that our current Shemona Esrei might be a type of embracing of both. And then the position of Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, who are we looking at here? Rabbi Nosson, the position of Rabbi Nosson that speaks about using it as a framing. First make me king, then we'll talk about me remembering you. Which could be, it's just a means to get to the central theme of a day of remembrance, of hopefully God doing good to us, but I think there's a subtext there of also standing in judgment, or it could be quite central. Everything starts with recognizing God. That, like the Shema Yisrael, if you do nothing on Rosh HaShanah other than get it into your head, sort of recognizing God, and that's part of your mentality, that is where it all begins, and then that allows us to get to the next sections, praying to God, God sending in judgment, praying for a good year, but praying for a messianic period, and so on. So 3 different ways of seeing this. And I shared with you also, I encourage you to think about what it would mean to focus on Malchiot with taking away the rest of everything. If Malchiot were the central theme, like Rabbi Akiva, forget that it's a Yom HaDin, forget, everything else, just the value of Malchios, of our embracing, celebrating our relationship to God, and also, as I sort of mentioned from the Sfas Emes, thinking about what a more godly world can look like, and how we can imagine that and think about aspects we want to do for this coming year to help realize that. So with that, I will end, and I think we still have 3 or 4 minutes for any final comments or questions.
We do, Rabbi Linzer. I'll ask you, first of all, to please stop sharing your screen. So
good point.
Your source sheet, again, is available in the chat and will be available after these Yemei Iyun as well. Before we get to a couple of minutes of questions,
figure out how to stop share. Oh, I see.
The little red button at the top.
Yeah. I think I know by now.
Everyone, I'll take a moment, first of all, just to thank Rabbi Linzer. Again, to thank Molly, our captionist, for keeping up with both of our speakers so far in this room. I just placed the schedule into the chat. If anyone would like to take a look at the schedule again, you can stay in this room, in room C, for BT row E, beginning at 12:05. You can move over to Amnon Bazak in room B, also at 12:05. And you can move over to Menachem Liebtag in room A, again at 12:05. If anyone has any questions, we have about a minute and a half left. Please place them into the chat at this time. In the meantime, Rabbi Linzer, I'll ask you maybe a meta question. You referred to the idea of looking at the Geniza and seeing different Girsaot, Shalom, Oseh Shalom, etc. I'm wondering how you feel about the fact that a lot of customs, and you mentioned Ashkenazim and Sfardim before, so many minhagim that were about Jewish communities that had diverged at different times, we've lost a lot of that because of publishing, because of communication, because of immigration. What do we do with that? What do we do with that?
Yeah. Well, obviously, that's a very large question, and I think it should just, it's maybe less of a question and more of a recognizing that and recognizing what is lost. I would often get annoyed about how in more Yekish shows they would have these Yotzarot and all these additions right in the middle of Shemona Esrei and Kriyas Shema. Of course, that was a major debate in the Middle Ages, and even if it's hard for me to sort of fully embrace because of my background that practice, like there's something that's very beautiful, not just about the poetry, but of recognizing a different type of a religious sensibility that wants to bring that type of distinctive poetry related to each Chag, very central into the Chag itself. Or as I mentioned before, do you have a barbecue on Rosh HaShanah, or are you super careful not to eat nuts because nuts have a gematria of chet, It's a very different type of a mentality. And I think that we still have retained that, in many ways, but I think the point you make is an excellent one, that the sort of global communication, printed books, standardization sort of has done a lot to level that. And I think that that's a real loss.